The Jets open their offseason with a smart move and shake up their offensive line. We'll talk about what it all means today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, February 27th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Well, the Jets made a major move to begin their offseason on Monday. The team has decided to release guard Laken Tomlinson. ESPN's Jeremy Fowler was the reporter who broke the story Monday night. We're going to talk about all of the implications of this move on today's episode. And I think I have to begin by saying you're welcome, America, because on Monday's show, I told you that I felt like the Jets were probably going to keep Laken Tomlinson, in part because the salary cap is rising by more than teams were expecting. The Jets have a little bit of extra breathing room. So I figured, well, the Jets will keep Laken Tomlinson, which guaranteed that they were going to cut him immediately. So you're welcome, everybody. But my first takeaway from this is that it is a good move. I'm pleasantly surprised by the New York Jets. And over the last 12 months, there have not been many moves where I've looked at and said, wow, that's a great move. There have not been many times where I've been pleasantly surprised that the Jets did something. I'll be honest with you. Based on the way the Jets have operated the last year, I figured they'd just figure out a way to make excuses for Laken Tomlinson. They'd say, well, the guys next to him haven't been very good. We'll get better play from him this next season. The reality, though, is that this is not a player who could justify an $18 million cap hit. And that's what he would have gotten if he was on the team in 2024. And that's just way too much money. That would have been just way too much money to pay Laken Tomlinson. Now, let's start by talking about the financials. Tomlinson, if he was on the Jets, would have made, or he would have counted $18.8 million against the cap. In fact, almost $18.9 million. So it would have been $18,880,000. By cutting him, the Jets save around $8.1 million. Now, Tomlinson still does have a dead money hit of $10 million, over $10 million, $10.74 million to be exact. That's a dead money hit. That's in part because the Jets restructured his contract a year ago and pushed more guarantees from 2023 to 2024. So the Jets really loaded up the dead money. And they should not have done that a year ago with Laken Tomlinson, especially a guy who was coming off a very shaky 2022, a guy who was coming off a very shaky first season. The Jets instead doubled down on him, pushed more dead money to the future, and now have a dead money hit for Tomlinson of over $10 million. But it still was the right move, even though Tomlinson's going to cost $10.74 million against the cap this year. I still think this is the right move because it clears out $8.14 million. So Jets now have $8.14 million in additional cap space. Now, of course, a big chunk of that $8.14 million is probably going to have to go to finding an offensive lineman to replace Tomlinson, but you would hope that they could use that money to find somebody who's going to be a more effective offensive lineman, because Laken Tomlinson, we don't talk about this enough, but Laken Tomlinson really was a Lazard-level bust. This was a really, really bad free agent contract, and I have to admit, I thought this would go better than it did, but Tomlinson was just dreadful. We want to talk pass protection. Top 15 in pressures allowed in 2022, his first season. Most pressures allowed at the guard position in 2023, the second season. So, guy who was top 15 in pressures allowed at his position both years. And, again, at the top of the league in pressures allowed his second season. You want to talk run blocking? I mean, you saw the Jets' run game the last 2 years. I don't think I need to go into the numbers, but the numbers are bad. Unless Breece Hall does something special in the run game, Jets can't do anything. That's not all Tomlinson's fault. And yes, there is an argument to be made that, the guys next to him were shaky. And on the offensive line, sometimes the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Sometimes the whole is less than the sum of the parts. A lot of it has to do with chemistry. A lot of it has to do with continuity. A lot of it has to do with, if the guy next to you is not doing his job, you're probably going to struggle. But the problem with Tomlinson is you could make an argument the only reason he got paid is that he played next to a first ballot Hall of Famer in San Francisco and Trent Williams. Before Tomlinson was with the Jets, he was with the San Francisco 49ers, playing next to Trent Williams, one of the great left tackles in the history of the league. So if we're going to talk about how not having good players next to him hurt him, I would argue that playing next to Trent Williams all those years in San Francisco made him look better than he really was. This was a guy in retrospect, and again, I can only say so much because at the time I thought the signing would work out pretty well. I was very happy with the signing, but it just did not work out. And in retrospect, I think you have to look back and say, the Jets probably overpaid for a guy who really was not very good. And they didn't just overpay. I mean, it's about just about $27 million for 2 seasons of subpar play. That's like around top 10 money at the guard position. So if the Jets can't use their money to find a better guard, or maybe they get a center and move Joe Tippmann out to guard. If the Jets can't do better than that, I mean, we've got bigger problems here. But I got to give the Jets credit here. The Jets actually, what's been my biggest complaint the last couple of weeks is that, and it's been true when they're dealing with the coaching staff, how they don't move on from Nathaniel Hackett, or they don't move on from the offensive line coach Keith Carter. My biggest issue with the Jets the last year, and really the last, last 13, last 55 years, it feels like the Jets very rarely just address mistakes. It feels like the Jets rarely move on from mistakes. The Jets always deny mistakes. The Jets always deny that there are issues. The Jets always try and work around issues. Here they finally addressed an issue, and they moved on from a player who simply was not doing the job. Now, there was an argument made by some members of the media last night that this was a bad move because Tomlinson's durable, and as bad as he's been, at least you could count on him to be on the field, which has not been true of many Jets linemen. The Jets have obviously been really banged up the last couple of years on the offensive line. They've had guys miss games, and Tomlinson's a guy who you can count on there to go out there and stay healthy. And I understand the argument, and I think there's something to it. Durability does help. Even a guy who's a bad starter, he's probably better than his backups. So if he can stay on the field, there's value in that. The problem, though, is that can't be the only thing you're bringing to the table. Your quality of play also really, really, really matters. So if you're a bad player who's durable, I mean, it's better than being a bad player who's always injured. But at the price Laken Tomlinson was going to cost the Jets, when there are cap savings of over $8 million, even if there's a dead money hit of over $10 million because you've not managed your cap effectively, you have to do it. Because if you can't find a better value on the offensive line, again, maybe it's a guard, maybe it's a center, for $8 million, and we know that like a lot of the contracts the Jets give out this offseason are probably going to have to be backloaded because of how little cap space they have and how many needs they have to fill. But if you can't find a better value than what Laken Tomlinson's provided the Jets the last 2 years, I don't know what you're doing. It's, maybe time to find a new career, because Laken Tomlinson, unfortunately for the New York Jets, was a very, very ineffective player. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to what the Jets' options are now that Laken Tomlinson is a former New York Jet. There are a couple different ways the Jets could address this, and we'll talk about them continuing this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. You should not have to worry when you buy tickets to the next big event. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. With killer last-minute deals, all in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee, Game Time takes all the guesswork out of buying tickets. They have last-minute tickets, flash deals, zone deals. You can see views from all the seats in the venue before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. And you can find exclusive flash deals and sponsored deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. I've used Game Time myself. It's super easy. You just open up the app, a couple taps, you're done. You get your tickets right away, and you find amazing deals. I still can't get over some of the deals I've gotten on last-minute tickets to sports, to theater. It's just a great place to go to get your tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON locked on for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's available on Amazon Fire TV on the free Fire TV Channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus their national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV Channels app. And today on Locked On Jets, we're talking Laken Tomlinson. The Jets decide to move on from the veteran guard, saving over $8 million in salary cap space. Again, I'm going to take credit because on Monday's show, I said I don't think the Jets will cut Tomlinson. So, of course, what happens is within hours, the Jets cut Tomlinson, and I think it's a good move. I have to say, I was expecting the Jets to do the wrong thing, and the Jets surprised me by doing the right thing. I could get used to something like that. Let's keep it going, Jets. Let's keep making smart moves. Now the Jets will have to make a decision. This now means that they need three new offensive linemen. They don't have either tackle spot settled. In fact, I think if the season began today, we'd be talking Max Mitchell and Carter Warren as the starting tackles. And I think it goes without saying that would not be a very good idea. So we can talk about tackles a lot. And we will talk about tackles a lot as we approach free agency. But the Tomlinson situation opens up an interesting discussion. And it's one we've talked about a little bit on the show. What do you do with Joe Tippmann? Do you leave him at center or do you put him at guard? Now, either way, he's going to be a starter for this team in 2024. And either way, I think we can expect pretty good play. And I mentioned this last week. At the end of the season, I was kind of up in the air on Tippmann. I thought there were some good games, there were some bad games, and then as I've gone back and I've kind of rewatched some of the film, and as I've thought through the stuff Tippmann was dealing with, I've become much more positive about where Tippmann's heading. Not that I was ever super negative, but I felt like there were some flaws in his game. But we consider the situation he was in. I think he held up pretty well for a rookie. I think he held up better than Tomlinson did. The question is, do you put him at center or do you put him at guard? Because I think he was having some success. There was a shaky game or two when he was playing guard earlier on in the season, but then Connor McGovern got hurt, so Tippmann moved to his natural position of center. It's worth noting, Tippmann did not play much guard in college, so this wasn't. Sometimes college players move up and down the line depending on what their team's needs are in a given year. Tippmann did not play much guard. I thought he took to it pretty well, though. At center, I thought it was a little more up and down. That could be in part due to the guys next to him because they had really shaky guards, including Tomlinson. But I do also question positional value, because I do think there's an argument to be made that a guy who can hold up at guard might have more value than a guy at center, because guards get more one-on-one matchups in today's NFL. And Tippmann's a guy who's very strong. He gets a hold on somebody and pushes them. It's the guy's going to be driven down the field a pretty long way, and the hole's going to be opened up, in the run game, or he's going to hold up in the passing game if he gets in. The quarterback's not going to have pressure in his face. Whereas the center position is more about kind of helping out, double teaming, helping the quarterback identify matchups. So Jets have kind of an interesting decision here. And to me, what the home run move would be is if they could somehow find a way to grab Connor Williams from Miami, another guy who kind of started his career at guard, but played center for the Dolphins a year ago, and played really well. And if you get to an interior offensive line of Connor Williams at center, and then AVT, Elijah Vera Tucker, and Joe Tippmann as your guards, that's going to be a very helpful thing for Aaron Rodgers, in my view. That means Aaron's not going to have a lot of pressure right up the middle in his face, and it also means that and I don't want to act like pass blocking a tackle becomes unimportant, because Jets really do need to figure out the two tackle spots, but there's going to be space for him to step up if there's pressure off the edge. If one of your tackles gets beat, and there's at least going to be move for Rodgers to maneuver within the pocket. And Rodgers is going to be playing in the pocket more than he has at any point in his career. I mean, the mobility is just not going to be there coming off the Achilles. Also at age 40, when his mobility, frankly, was already in decline the last couple of years in Green Bay. To me, if they could get Connor Williams, that would be a great move. But the Jets could also go to a more affordable place. We know that the Jets the last couple of years have really focused on bringing veteran guys in. So a guy like Kevin Zeitler, who's going to be 34, could very well be an option because of his advanced age. That's a guy who, could be more affordable when we talk about players who are available in free agency. Another guy about to hit free agency, somebody the Jets may have looked at the trade deadline, Ezra Cleveland. Jaguars made a deal for him at the deadline. They acquired him from Minnesota. He's about to hit free agency, so that's a potential option. Guy from Green Bay, John Runyon, the son of a guy who was a great tackle in the NFL, spent time with a number of teams, but maybe best known for Philadelphia Eagles, the same name, John Runyon. His son is also named John Runyon, and he played guard for the Packers, so he has like the Aaron Rodgers connection, although his career has been a little bit more up and down. So Jets could also just leave the Tippmann at center and bring in a guard. And you would hope that $8 million. You can also remember the Jets are probably going to backload one of these deals, a lot of the deals they signed this offseason. So just signing somebody for $8 million, the player's long-term salary doesn't necessarily need to be $8 million. They could sign somebody for an $8 million cap hit this year, and then the cap hit goes up in 2025 and 2026. But you would hope they could find somebody who's a little bit more effective than what they got from Laken Tomlinson this past season. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll keep our attention on the offensive side of the ball, but we'll leave New York because a player who would have made a lot of sense as a free agent target for the Jets has received the franchise tag. We'll talk about who that is and what it means for the Jets going forward as we continue on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Again, that's $150 if your bet wins. A very exciting time in the NBA as the regular season winds down. Teams are battling for playoff positioning. Some teams are focused on getting a top seed so they get home court advantage the first few rounds. Some teams are just focused on getting one of the top 6 seeds so that they avoid the play-in. And still there are other teams that just want to get into the play-in. Well, no matter what sort of team you root for, you can go to FanDuel. You can bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Again, it's quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. We've been talking about Laken Tomlinson, but we'll now turn our attention to the wide receiver position because a player who was set to hit free agency has been franchised. It's T. Higgins, the great Bengals wide receiver player who has posted 2,000-yard seasons in his first 4 years in the NFL, a player who likely would have been a Jets target in free agency had he hit the market. He has received the franchise tag from his team, the Cincinnati Bengals. And this is no surprise. There were always two things about T. Higgins. Number one is if he hit the market, if he became a free agent, this was a player the Jets should have gone all out to get. The second thing about him was it was always very unlikely he was going to hit the market. The Bengals are obviously a team at the top of the AFC. They're trying to compete for a Super Bowl. They don't really want to get maybe the best number 2 receiver, let the best number 2 receiver in the NFL leave without getting any sort of compensation in return. The Bengals also had a lot of salary cap space, so giving him the franchise tag is no problem. Will they keep him? Will they trade him? I would assume they'll keep him. But even if they want to, even if they're ready to move on from him, even if they can't work out a contract, now by tagging him, they can at least try and trade him to get something in return. Higgins would have been a perfect fit stylistically for the Jets at the receiver position. Even though I'm not a big believer that you have to match styles at the receiver position, I think as long as you have guys who are really talented, it doesn't really matter what their styles are. But what are the Jets missing? They're missing a bigger guy. They're missing a guy who, can make contested catches. T. Higgins would have been a perfect fit for the New York Jets. But, it was always unlikely because of how good he is, because of how perfect of a fit he is for the Jets, it was unlikely that the Bengals were going to let him go. That's kind of the catch-22 in the NFL. Anybody who's good, you have competition for. And when the guy's really good, they don't hit free agency. It's very rarely the top-level talent who hits the open market because their team wants to keep them and their teams have the franchise tag at their disposal. So the Jets will need to move in a different direction. There were reports the Jets were set to go after T. Higgins in the unlikely event he hit the open market. So I guess the phrase I would use is it's disappointing, but it's really not surprising. I think anybody who was paying attention realized that it was, there was not much of a chance T. Higgins was going to hit free agency. So now the Jets will turn their attention to other options. If based on the buzz we're getting, it seems like the two guys the Jets are going to look to target. It does feel like the Jets are going to look to add a high-end wide receiver this offseason. Now, let's take Davante Adams out of the picture for now. Now, there's all sorts of speculation the Jets are going to go after him, but at this point, there's very little to suggest the Raiders are going to look to trade him. And there's also reports that, a lot of the Raiders players really went to bat for Antonio Pierce when the Raiders were deciding who their coach was going to be. There were a number of guys who really said, we want Pierce as our guy. And, Max Crosby was the most famous one because Max Crosby actually said, I'm demanding a trade if you guys don't hire Pierce. But while Davante Adams did not take it that far, there was a lot of talk. Davante Adams was one of the guys who really, told their management, we need Antonio Pierce. This is our guy. So Antonio Pierce, of course, got the Raiders head coaching job on a permanent basis, which, presumably means that Davante Adams is very happy with the Raiders. And I don't know that the Raiders are necessarily going to want to move on from Davante Adams. I think that's doubly true if the rumors that the Raiders are going to try and draft a quarterback this year, because one thing you should not do when you draft a quarterback is trade your team's number one receiver. We'll call that the Carolina Panthers rule, Carolina Panthers law, because they traded DJ Moore last year to move up to number one overall, which we're talking about moves that just boggle your mind. That's up there, but that's not a place we need to go right now. The point is, I think it's unlikely Davante Adams is going to actually hit the market. So I think the two guys the Jets are rumored to go after are Mike Evans from Tampa Bay, guy who every single year he's been in the NFL, been in the NFL 10 seasons. 10 seasons he's gone over 1,000 yards. So the model of consistency. Another guy stylistically who I think would be a good fit with Garrett, another bigger guy who's very good at contested catches. And then Calvin Ridley from Jacksonville, who's about to turn 30. I got to be honest with you, I worry about the contract Ridley's going to get because he's one of those receivers. He's been good. I don't know that he's ever been great. I think that he's going to have a lot of interest when he hits the market. I think that, there are teams out there who are going to be interested, but because there are very rarely great players who hit the open market, the good guys like Calvin Ridley tend to get overpaid by quite a bit. I think in a situation where we got Joe Douglas trying to save his job, in a situation where, if the Jets aren't good this year, doesn't matter for Douglas. He's not going to be the one to clean up the mess. In this situation where the Jets are really, really short-term focused, I do worry a little bit about the contract Calvin Ridley would get, but I don't think there's any question he'd be an upgrade over what the Jets have at the receiver position. But this was to be expected. Now, I think all eyes now are on Mike Evans because now the last couple of days there's been some buzz building that the Bucs are going to try and keep Evans in Tampa Bay for the rest of his career. And if they do that, then the Jets' options at the receiver position become quite limited. And I think that you'll start to see I think once free agency comes, you will see the team go all in after a Calvin Ridley. Anyway, but that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Hope you have a great Tuesday, everybody. Tomorrow, we're going to have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday, we try and do a mailbag with listener questions. So please send in your questions. I look forward to answering them.